Hello, I'm Ben and you're watching The PhD Parent. So which of the following do you reckon best captures what it means for a kid to be a picky eater? First, a kid who doesn't eat a wide variety of foods because they reject familiar foods and won't try new foods. Second, a kid who either doesn't eat a wide enough variety of foods or doesn't eat enough food because they reject familiar foods and won't try new foods. Third, a kid who rejects familiar foods and won't try new foods, causing problems for the kid, their parents, and or the relationship between the kid and their parents. Fourth, a kid who doesn't eat enough food, particularly veggies, and has strong food preferences, resulting in their parents having to prepare special meals for them. And fifth, a kid who doesn't eat a wide variety of foods, doesn't want to try new foods, doesn't eat many veggies, has strong food preferences, and parents must prepare special meals for them. Now, each of these definitions was taken from a published study, and there were others that I could have included. As you can see, these definitions are similar, but vary in terms of whether the focus is on the variety of food eaten, the amount of food eaten, whether a particular food group is specified, and whether the impact of these eating habits on the kid and or family is considered. Now, multiple ways of defining a construct is not uncommon, but it can be a bit of a problem, as I'll highlight in the next couple of sections. So in the following, I'm going to discuss the prevalence of picky eating, the age at which this tends to be most prevalent, the persistence of picky eating, and finally I'll review research that's investigated the differences between picky and non-picky eaters in terms of their eating habits. But before doing so, one quick thing is to mention what might be considered an extreme form of picky eating, and that is avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, or ARFID. So, as just mentioned, ARFID can be considered an extreme form of picky eating. And this disorder was introduced into clinical manuals in 2013, and it's an eating disorder where, as the name suggests, a kid shows an avoidance of food or restricts their food intake. In ARFID, this avoidance or restriction results in the kid not meeting their nutritional or energy requirements, and they may either be losing weight or failing to gain weight as developmentally expected. In ARFID, some kids may show a lack of interest in food, others may avoid or restrict their food intake due to the sensory qualities of food, for example, how it looks, smells, feels, or tastes. And some may avoid or restrict their food intake because of a fear of what might happen if they eat. For example, they may vomit or choke. ARFID can be quite serious and typically will require professional help. So in the current video, the information I discuss about picky eating doesn't concern ARFID, but instead concerns picky eating as it occurs amongst non-clinical kids. So onto the prevalence of picky eating. So I came at this issue by taking a look at studies included in a review of the picky eating literature carried out by Taylor in 2015. In this review, Taylor considered the findings from 27 different studies. Across the studies, there were several differences, which among other things included how picky eating was defined, how picky eating was assessed, how often kids' eating habits were assessed, how old the kids were, how big the sample was, and the country in which the study was conducted. Now, not surprisingly, across these studies, the estimates of picky eating varied significantly, ranging from about 5% up to about 60%. Given the major differences between studies, I don't reckon it's possible to pull out a meaningful overall estimate of the prevalence of picky eating. Now, just to illustrate, consider how picky eating was defined across the studies. One approach was to define picky eating based upon specified behaviours, for example, eating a different meal to everyone else in the family. The other approach was to not provide a definition, instead leaving it up to the parent to decide whether they thought their kid was a picky eater. Now, the good thing about the first approach is that it involves defining what picky eating is. The bad thing, as mentioned, is that different researchers have different ideas about which behaviours are relevant, resulting in differences across studies in terms of how picky eating is defined. This means that one kid may be considered a picky eater in one study, but not another, which will inevitably lead to differences in the estimates of prevalence across studies. Now, while not perfect, this approach is less problematic than not providing a definition. So if you were to put a positive spin on not providing a definition of picky eating, then you might say that the most important thing to know is whether a parent thinks their kid is a picky eater, irrespective of whether their kid actually is a picky eater. Because if a parent thinks their kid has a problem, then that's a problem. However, the not so positive spin is that if you're interested in a phenomenon, such as picky eating, then you should have a clear definition of that phenomenon. And you should be ensuring that the people who participate in this study know what that definition is. Otherwise, you have absolutely no idea what you're assessing when you ask participants about that phenomenon. So this approach will lead to differences in prevalence estimates across studies because parents are going to have all sorts of different ideas about what picky eating is. So in summary, working out what the prevalence of picky eating is messy. And it's really not clear what the prevalence is. So now on to when is picky eating most prevalent. For this next section, put aside the problems with the definition of picky eating. It complicates things too much. So definitions aside, it's probably the case that the prevalence of picky eating differs across age groups, though not a slam dunk case. So to illustrate, some studies have found that age matters. For example, Cano, in a sample of about 4,000 kids who were assessed when they were 1.5, 3 and 6 years old, found that the prevalence of picky eating was highest when kids were 3 years old, close to 30%, and it was lowest when kids were 6 years old, about 15%. Hafstad found similar results, with the highest prevalence rate obtained when kids were 3.5 years old, though the kids in this study weren't followed up beyond this point. And finally, in a large sample of about 14,000 kids who were assessed when they were 2, 3, 4.5 and 5.5 years old, Taylor reported that the prevalence of picky eating was highest when kids were 3 years old, about 15%. Now, there have been other small-scale studies, but the capacity of these studies to provide confidence in the estimates of prevalence across ages is limited by their small samples. Now, in contrast to these studies, others have found that age doesn't matter. So in a sample of about 1,500 kids who were assessed when they were 2.5, 3.5 and 4.5 years old, Dubois found that the prevalence of picky eating was relatively stable, sitting at about 15%. Marchie and Colin recruited 800 kids and assessed their eating habits when they were 12 months old and up to when they were 21 years old, which is a pretty impressive follow-up. And they found relatively stable rates in the prevalence of picky eating, which were around about 30%. And finally, Steinsbeck, in a sample of about 1,000 kids who were assessed when they were 4 years old and 6 years old, found that the prevalence of picky eating was about 25% at both time points. So, taken together, the results of these studies are mixed. But if anything, I'd be leaning towards saying that kids around the age of 3 years would be the pickiest eaters. And this is because the studies with the largest samples have found this. Generally speaking, the bigger the sample, the more robust the results. So now on to once a picky eater, always a picky eater. The previous studies were looking at the prevalence of picky eating. And what's meant by prevalence, in this instance, is the percentage of kids who are picky eaters at a specified point in time. Prevalence rates don't tell you anything about the persistence of picky eating. However, some of the studies previously discussed have looked at the rates of persistent picky eating. And once more, inconsistent definitions are a problem, with the criteria for persistent differing across studies, though it was usually along the lines of being a picky eater at each assessment point within a study. So in Taylor, the researchers found that about 75% of kids were identified as a picky eater at some point, and about 10% of kids were persistent picky eaters. In Cano, the results showed that while about 45% of kids were identified as a picky eater at some point, around 5% of kids were persistent picky eaters. Next, Dubois found that about 30% of kids were identified as a picky eater at some point, and about 5% of kids were persistent picky eaters. And lastly, in Steinsbeck, the researchers found that while about 30% of kids were identified as a picky eater at some point, around 15% of kids were persistent picky eaters. So, if you do the maths, these estimates suggest that somewhere between 10 to 15%, but could be as high as 50%, of kids who are picky eaters will become persistent picky eaters. In other words, if a kid is a picky eater, it's far more likely that this behaviour will stop rather than becoming a lasting problem. Nevertheless, for a decent proportion of kids, this picky eating will become a more entrenched issue. So lastly, what do picky eaters tend to not eat? So in this section, I'm going to look at research that's investigated the difference between picky and non-picky eaters in terms of the foods they eat. I came across 9 studies. I'm sure there are more, but this is a good start. And when assessing food consumption, some studies relied upon questionnaires, such as the Children's Dietary Questionnaire. Some had parents keep food diaries for a few days, and others required parents to report what their kids had eaten across the previous 24 hours. The following table provides a brief overview of the studies. For the most part, these studies assess intake of the same kinds of foods, and I've indicated observed differences in the types of food consumed between picky and non-picky eaters. So as you can see, the most consistent finding is that picky eaters eat fewer vegetables than non-picky eaters. A close second is that they also eat less fruit. To be honest, I thought meat would be up there. Pops up a couple of times, but doesn't appear to be a consistent finding. The only caveat I would put on that is that the finding that picky eaters consume less meat is evident in studies with larger samples. As mentioned, you can generally put more weight on the findings of studies with larger samples, so maybe differences in meat consumption is a genuine finding. But picky eaters definitely don't seem to like vegetables. Now the next question is, what can you do about picky eating? So that's a topic I've covered in the following videos where I consider interventions with the most research support. Specifically, in one video, I discussed the impact of repeated exposure on food consumption. In another video, I discussed the impact of providing a variety of food on food consumption. And also a video in which I discuss potentially unhelpful ways of increasing food consumption. For the moment though, that's it for this introduction to picky eating. If there's anything I've gotten wrong, any important research I've overlooked, or if you have any questions, then feel free to get in touch. Otherwise, happy parenting.